Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Jeff Haight, and I'm a PhD student at Arizona State University. And today I would like to share with you our ongoing research looking at the relationships between people and wildlife communities in the desert city of Phoenix, Arizona. So I'd like to start off by framing our research by highlighting that diverse communities of wildlife can persist within the same places where people live, work, and play. To fully appreciate and manage these diverse communities, we need to understand the social ecological patterns that drive their composition. Fundamentally, the main drivers of wildlife community characteristics are resources, food, water, shelter, and how those resources vary over both space and time. Now, across a variety of systems, both natural and human altered, disturbances, pronounced changes in ecological conditions, are typically what creates that heterogeneity of resources, that patchiness. As such, disturbance is widely recognized as shaping biodiversity. For many wildlife taxa and systems, especially urban systems, we generally observe decreases in local species diversity with increased disturbance. In other cases, we may find what appears to be a peak in diversity at moderate levels of disturbance. This would be reflective of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which is based on the idea that moderate disturbance might maximize resource heterogeneity and thus biodiversity. And then in some other cases, we may even see increases in diversity with greater levels of disturbance, especially when we're talking about diversity of introduced and non-native and R-selected species. Within urban systems, people are the source of disturbance, creating these complex patterns of resources and shaping wildlife communities. We can both observe and predict any of these above patterns in relation to urbanization. However, it can be difficult to tease apart relationships between wildlife diversity and urbanization when you consider the direct effects people have by adding resources to these systems. For instance, urbanization can dampen the relationship between resource heterogeneity and biodiversity within arid cities, where people often tend to increase the productivity of their landscapes. Luckily, this actually makes desert cities particularly suited and ideal for exploring how wildlife diversity relates to both anthropogenic disturbance and resource availability. But it is important to recognize that although species and communities are directly responding to patterns of disturbance and resources, those ecological patterns within cities are inextricably linked with a city's human social characteristics. Furthermore, in order to really comprehend the meaning of these patterns of urban wildlife diversity, we need to explore how different groups of species respond to urbanization. This is important because the ways in which people react to the presence of wildlife diversity in cities will depend on what type of wildlife we're talking about. For instance, how people interact with larger carnivores, such as coyotes, will be different from how they interact with smaller herbivores, such as squirrels. Additionally, we must consider that these wildlife guilds may utilize different resources within urban landscapes, leading one to ask, how might the diversity of these guilds within the wildlife community respond to different characteristics of the urban landscape? With that last question in mind, our main objective is to explore how wildlife diversity varies in relation to ecological and social characteristics that are associated with urbanization in Phoenix, Arizona. Specifically, we hypothesize first that species richness will be negatively associated with urbanization metrics and positively associated with vegetation productivity. And secondly, that richness of trophic guilds will respond to different landscape characteristics, particularly that carnivores would relate more strongly to human population density and herbivores would relate more strongly to vegetation productivity. Our research is conducted within the metropolitan area of Phoenix, Arizona, which is the study area of the Central Arizona Phoenix Long-Term Ecological Research Site, or CAP-LTER. This is a historically agricultural region that is noted for being one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country, having urbanized quite rapidly since the mid-20th century. And this region is also located within the hot, arid Sonoran Desert, which results in some unique resource gradients that make them ideal for studying biodiversity patterns. As I mentioned, there's these higher and more variable levels of vegetation productivity within these areas year-round, within the urban areas, rather. year round. So we started by evaluating urbanization in this area using a structural metric based on the proportion of roads and buildings surrounding each point in this map, with more urban areas depicted in the lighter colors. Then based on this metric, we established an array of 50 randomized locations across the study area for surveying wildlife across this full gradient of urbanization. But in order to look at a more human-based metric of urbanization, we also represent urbanization in terms of the density of people, which we derive from census block data for 2010. And while these two metrics of urban land cover are highly correlated across the study area and at our 50 sites in particular, especially at low levels of urbanization, at higher levels of urbanization, that relationship becomes quite a bit more variable, leading to these key areas of divergence that could be important. Viewed side by side, it becomes a little easier what areas I may be talking about. There are these more industrial areas that correspond to really high urban land cover, our highest urban land covers, but very, very low population densities. And then there are these more residential areas that have the highest population densities, but only moderate levels of urban land cover. This is where the difference starts to take shape. So with the support of CAP-LTR and the Urban Wildlife Information Network, we have been surveying wildlife communities at these sites using motion-triggered wildlife cameras since December 2018. Today, I'll be sharing data from our summer season of July 2019. And we're looking at a variety of landscape variables potentially associated with patterns of wildlife diversity, but today I'll focus on just a few. We have the two flavors of urbanization that I just talked about. And then we have a metric of vegetation productivity, which, as I mentioned, is not highly correlated with urbanization in our area. We then estimated overall species richness and guild level richness using a multi-species occupancy modeling approach that utilized each of our individual landscape variables as covariates. In total, we observed 18 unique species during this period, which we then split into our two trophic guilds. So we have our 9 carnivore species ranging in size from the coyote down to greater roadrunner. And we have our 9 herbivore species, which range from the collared peccary and mule deer down to ground squirrels and quail. So first off, we did find a general decline in overall species richness with both increasing urban land cover and increasing population density. Though the relationships with population density are noticeably less gradual, with a sort of drop off at these moderate levels of population density. We additionally found an increase in richness in relation to NDVI, though our study was not, our sites don't really sample across a full gradient of NDVI, you could say. So there's not such a strong relationship observed there. So when we split the community into our two trophic guilds, we do find the same overall patterns. There may be subtle differences to note, such as greater variation in the estimates of herbivore richness on the bottom. However, overall, these results would seem to suggest that our two different trophic guilds are responding to these three metrics in a similar manner to one another. So in conclusion, we did find a general decrease in species richness with greater urbanization and lower NDVI, which was somewhat in line with our first hypothesis. However, we've yet to find much support for the idea that the different trophic guilds are responding more or less strongly to different landscape variables. So not much support for our second hypothesis yet. Now, none of the metrics very precisely predicted species richness, and it's my own suspicion that no single landscape metric will ever be able to fully predict patterns of diversity, as there is the potential for interactions between these variables, and we are looking at a variety of species, each with their own habitat needs. Lastly, in some cases, more social landscape variables, such as human population density, may actually be better predictors of species occupancy and diversity. We're still looking into this right here, but it's still something to keep in mind. So what next? Well, we're continuing to explore a variety of landscape variables and their influences on wildlife communities across a range of spatial and temporal scales. We're also looking at integrating this ecologically based data with social research relating to human perception behaviors towards wildlife. Currently, our study design does make this a bit challenging, as our randomized survey locations do not yet overlap well with existing study areas that evaluate existing studies that evaluate people's perceptions, values, and behaviors related to the environment. For instance, CAPI-LTER has a long history of collecting such data through the Phoenix Area Social Survey, which occurs within these neighborhoods of varying socioeconomic characteristics, but currently we don't have cameras in those neighborhoods. But I am pleased to say that one of our next steps will be to shift our focus, moving some of our cameras into these neighborhoods and unifying our collection of social and ecological data, enabling us to ask us new and more exciting social ecological questions. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening and thank our supporters and partners at CAP-LTR and the Urban Wildlife Information Network. I will be happy to answer any of your questions and feel free to contact me using the information below. Thank you for listening.